thank you very much for joining us for today's program, Rio Abajo Cultural Traditions During the Late Prehistoric Early Colonial Periods, a view from Goat Spring Pueblo, New Mexico with Dr. Suzanne Eckert. I'm Maggie Onosorgan, the Public Programs Manager here at the Amerind. And before we begin our program, we would like to acknowledge that the Amerind is located in southern Arizona on lands where the Otham, Hopi, Zuni, Yoeme, and Apache families have lived for generations, whose wisdom and traditions live on today in vibrant communities. We are very grateful for what all of these communities, rich in history, have to teach us. We would also like to thank all our members and donors that enable the Amerind to provide these free online programs and to fulfill our mission to foster and promote the knowledge and understanding of the Native peoples of the Americas through research, education, and community engagement. To learn how you can assist the Amerind in supporting its mission and programs by becoming a member or donor, please visit our website, amerind.org. For those of you who might be in the area this weekend, tomorrow, Sunday, from 10 to 4 is the final day of our Seri Comcac show and sale. Come and meet artists Miguel Estrella, Martha Monroe, and Maria Francisca Moreno. Learn about the art and culture of the Comcac Seri people of Sonora, Mexico. We also have just opened up 2 new exhibits in our art gallery, a beautiful Apache basket exhibit featuring pieces from our permanent collection, and a show of 3 contemporary artists from the Pasca Yaqui Nation. We also have many more in-person events starting in November and more online talks in the works, so please watch our website for more details. So today, if you have any questions for Dr. Eckert, please type them in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many as possible after her presentation. Today's program will be recorded and sent to all of you who registered, and it will also be available to watch on our YouTube channel at Amerind Foundation later this evening. We are so pleased to have educator and researcher Dr. Suzanne Eckert, who is the head of collections at the Arizona State Museum in Tucson. She earned her doctorate in 2003 in anthropology from Arizona State University. Dr. Eckert's research focuses on how late ancestral Pueblo cultures organize ceramic technology. She is especially interested in how this technology integrated with other aspects of society, including migration, political and social organization, religious practice and ideology, and gender and ethnic relations. She is just back from the field in time for this talk, so please welcome Dr. Suzanne Eckert.
Thank you, Maggie.
Yeah,
thank you for inviting me. This talk is all brand new. This is all new information that I'm presenting. And it really, this invitation really let my co-PI, Deb Huntley, and I an opportunity to kind of organize thoughts about our recent work at Goat Spring Pueblo and to tell folks what we've been up to. So this is a work in progress. We are just beginning to get some publications out, and we are doing the last bits of analyses so that we can finish the report. So please keep that in mind. And I look forward to questions, in part because we're still thinking through a lot of our interpretations. I also, before I move on to the next slide, want to point out that up in the corner, there is a counter of slides. My students have informed me that this is nice to have when working through slides. So I put those on there for everybody, so you know how soon I'll be done. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about different aspects, a little bit of the background of where Goat Spring Pueblo even is, what the site is, our results from our excavations, especially in terms of architecture, and then our artifact analyses, sort of the basic analyses that we've done, and then also some what we've been calling enriched deposits at the end, which is sort of unusual things that we found at the site and how we're interpreting those things. So if you look, I think you can see my pointer. Goat Spring Pueblo is the blue star. This area over here is where we are now working. We've sort of moved to the west and we're working in a slightly different area. And that's where we were doing our excavations the last 2 weeks. But this is the location of Goat Spring Pueblo. In the late 90s, we went on a tour of various sites in the Rio Abajo area. So basically the area mostly south of Albuquerque along the Rio Grande. And we went with Linda Cordell, for those of you who may have known her, because she was trying to help Deb and I develop a post-PhD project. And as soon as Deb and I walked over Goat Spring Pueblo, we knew that this is the site we were interested in working at next. There were some really interesting questions that could be asked, or we believed could be asked. And it's also a manageable size. Some sites are so big that you don't even know where to begin, and it would take years to get anywhere from the work. Other sites are fairly small and don't have kind of the same kinds of research questions. So we chose the site based upon the manageability of the site and the kinds of questions that were available. So this is standing on the site, looking both west and east. The site is located at about 6,000 feet. It's in the eastern edge of the Bear Mountains on the Cibola National Forest, for those of you familiar with the National Forest, and it's located in the foothills. It's about 5 miles away from the modern town of Magdalena. And when you look west, you're looking into the mountains. But when you look east, because you're in the foothills, you're looking out on the Plano San Lorenzo. It's the Rio Grande floodplain. And the site is about 25 miles from the Rio Grande. And you can see, this is a morning picture looking east, and you can see the fog that is rising off of the river. So the location is really at two sort of environmental areas, and with access to those two areas. This is a picture of the site. This is an aerial view of the site that I will talk about a little bit more later, that has some stratigraphy over it. But H.P. Mara first recorded the site in the 1930s. So people have known about the site for a while. And she recorded it as an ancestral Pueblo village that has 3 room blocks. And other researchers have estimated that there's about 200 to 3, or at the time had estimated that there were about 200 to 300 ground floor rooms, and a possibility that 2 of the room blocks were 2 stories. So if you look, this is a photo taken from one of the hills nearby. This is the north room block. This is the east room block. They are not connected. I'll show a map in a little bit. And the south room block is right in here. And we'll talk about why you can't see it very well. Same thing here. You can see with the topography lines, the north room block, you can see the west room block, and you can kind of make out the southern room block. And none of the room blocks are connected. That was one of the things we tested. Various other researchers had had visited the site, so it was kind of nice to sort of build off previous research. Marshall and Walt included it as part of their 1984 Rio Abajo survey. Michael Bletzer revisited the site in the early 2000s as part of his PhD work. And then the Forest Service has done various mapping projects out there. However, most specifically, Emmylou Davis and James Winkler from UCLA excavated the site out in the 60s. They did not backfill. So what you're looking at here is one of the rooms they excavated, and they left it open. And what you're looking at here is the trench that went through the kiva. And they also excavated a few other areas. And then they wrote a very short report. And let's say the report was not as formative as it could be. And as I have told many people, one of my absolute favorite lines of any report ever written comes from their report. And it basically said, under macrobotanicals, an adequate amount of corn was found. So that is the amount of detail that they reported. So this allowed us to go back and rely on some of their work, because their collections are at the Lab of Anthro, and also explore what kind of damage had been done, which is important for the Forest Service. Oh, sorry. So I'll talk about that a little bit more later, because there's also some looting at the site, which I'll show in the next in one of the maps. In terms of dating the site, previous researchers, the initial chronology suggested, based upon surface collections, that the site dated from somewhere between 1300 to 1680, possibly that entire time range. And so for those of you unfamiliar with Rio Grande glazeware pottery, all of the decorated pottery on the site are Rio Grande glazeware. And the way that Rio Grande archaeologists date glazeware is by the rim form. And so this is a map of the rim forms with, in theory, a figure of the rim forms. In theory, with A being the earliest and F being the latest. And so this is what you're looking at here. Here's a sherd, here's a profile of that sherd rim, and that's what you're looking at in these drawings. However, as you can see by this map or this figure, there's a lot of overlap between rim form types, right? So A and B, right? I have even 15 plus, 1500 plus, 1600 plus here. They may extend even farther at some sites. And so it's not the best system in the world that you could have, but it does tend to work. But what you're really dating is the presence of just A and B rims, or A and B rims and C and D rims, or E and F rims. It's not a perfect system. So one of the things we hope to do was to get a better chronology and understand the occupation of this site, knowing that this was all from surface collections. The environmental location, as I mentioned, is really at this crossroads, or at this middle point between the mountains and the floodplains. So there's lots of different kinds of plants and animals that are available. I had a student who did a study on the available plants, and basically within 15 kilometers of the site, there are 84 plants that have been collected for ethnographic use. And more importantly, to the paper that Casey Wayne did, that there were plants that were available all year long. So all 4 seasons, there was always some kind of plant that was available. And then there was also a lot of plants that are available that could be stored for food. In terms of animals, you've got mule deer, elk, antelope, of course, various kinds of bunnies. There's bear, there's mountain lions even today. So sort of your general typical suite of animals that we think of as being in the Southwest. Geological resources, this was really interesting to Deb and I because we are ceramicists. Within 30 kilometers of the site, there's 3 important geological resources. So this is the site, the star. There is lead, the north, these circles right here. There's lead that would have been available to make your glazed paint on your glazed painted pottery. There is obsidian. Can you see the McDaniel tank obsidian? So there's local obsidian source. And then smithsonite, this diamond. Smithsonite is a blue-green mineral that can be worked like turquoise. And this is the only source of the blue-green smithsonite in all of New Mexico. And I actually think in all of North America, but definitely in all of New Mexico. The other interesting thing about the location of the site is that it is located along a known major trail between Western Pueblo people and Eastern Pueblo people. And that was a historic trail where folks came down, came across, and then right to the south of the site, they would enter into Socorro and be in the Rio Grande area. So there's lots of things that were going on at this site, potentially for research. So the kinds of questions that we were interested in was maybe the movement of people, ideas, and technology between Western and Eastern Pueblo folks. The early 1300s is a time of a lot of social and demographic and settlement reorganization. So we know people are moving around. Maybe Goat Spring Pueblo was one of those places. Access and control of different kinds of resources. As I said, the obsidian, the lead, and the smithsonite. We know that during Spanish contact, or we knew supposedly during Spanish contact that trade networks got interfered with. And so we thought, well, maybe if you have contact with the Spanish, and here's a site up in the foothills, and the Spanish talk about there being sites up in the foothills, but that they did not go and visit them. but that maybe the presence of the obsidian, lead, and smithsonite would allow Pueblo people at Goat Spring Pueblo to continue their practices if they lost access to various other exchange networks. Other ideas that we had is if this site dates into the early colonial period, being up here in the foothills, maybe it was a resistance site, right? You move up into the foothills to get away from the Spanish. Or maybe it was a refuge site after 1680 and after the Pueblo Revolt. So these were the kinds of questions that seemed really, really exciting to us. Our results do not necessarily match these original questions, but this was the direction we were going in. So today, that's what I'm going to do, is talk about what we actually found. Okay, so field work. This is a draft map that I have put our work on. I am working on a better map with total station shots. I really had hoped to finish it by this talk, but I was in the field for 2 weeks instead. So there is going to be a better map, but this is an initial map to give you a sense of what we were doing. So the blue areas are looted rooms. It actually looks like more of this area was looted than just these 3 rooms. The green areas are where we believe Davis and Winkler excavated in the 60s, and then they left those rooms open. And then the red areas are where we tested for various reasons. Either because we suspected things might have been looted, or because of erosional concerns, or trying to understand some of the below ground stratigraphy. So for example, we did shovel test pits in some of these depressions to see if they were actual other kivas or pit houses or something like that. And I'll talk about the results of those explorations in just a bit. Okay, so one of the things we did was a lot of 1-by-1 tests, and I have highlighted on the map those areas. This allowed us to assess damage in areas where Emmylou Davis put the backfill, we think. We were looking for her backfill piles. The kiva especially is very deep, and so there had to be a backfill pile somewhere. It allowed us to determine erosional areas for intact deposits. So for example, back here, we thought there was a midden. It turns out this is all sheet trash that is washing out from the site and going into the Goat Spring Pueblo Arroyo. And so this is erosional out here, and it's not intact deposits. And then we also hoped that if we did get into some intact deposits and stratigraphy, it would be helpful for chronology building, since we didn't really have a good sense of the chronology of the site. We did get material that we hoped would help with the chronology. So we got burnt organic material for C14 dating. We got almost 75 pieces of wood for dendrochronology. The C14 dates come back in the 1400s, 1500s, and 1600s. So we knew that based upon the glazes, and it seemed like, oh, maybe this site really does date over this huge period of time, although there's not a lot of trash to support such long-term occupation. So that was interesting. We got lots of wood. None of the wood was able to be used for dendrochronology. They're either not big enough or they are the wrong species. If any of you are familiar with the experimental or new technique that U of A is doing called wiggle matching, which is one of the coolest names ever, where there's a combination of C14 dating and dendrochronology dating. We tried that too, and it also didn't work. So we got lots of material, but none of it helped really with the chronology, other than to say, yes, the site dates to what the ceramics suggested dates to. However, the stratigraphy, this is another student project. The stratigraphy in these various units that are deep, and this is the one that matches this here. The stratigraphy does show that there's some kinds of problems and that we are probably in backfill in some places. Specifically, you shouldn't have this much glaze D before you have glaze A. You shouldn't have this much glaze F before you have glaze E. You shouldn't have Howie-Coo down here as it is early, or it's older, it's much, it's much younger than these types. So, and this is just one of the pits from a student project. And so this is something that I haven't had a chance to go back and look at in the report writing. I'm trying to finish off some of the other ceramic analysis. Well, I have now. But so this is one of the things that we're going to go back, and I'm going to look at the profiles and see if I can figure out with the profiles if there's a real obvious place that the chronology was messed up because of backfill. Well, because of Emmylou Davis's backfill. So I think this is something that can be figured out, but it is not as clear as I would like it to be. But we're working on that. So we also excavated in architecture, mostly where Emmylou dug or other disturbed rooms, either from erosion or looters. This allowed us to assess any damage that had been done, to figure out where floors were, if there were any floors that still remained from looted areas, and to expose the masonry, specifically to compare masonry styles across the site. So we worked in each of the rooms. And so this is the areas that had the highest disturbance. This is a picture of this room. And you can see there's a floor intact along the wall, which was nice to see. We didn't come across any other features in this room or most of the other rooms. There's a hearth in one room and a metate in one room, but in general, there's not a lot of features in these rooms that we cleared out. But it was nice to know where the floor actually was. We did go below the floor in places to see if there were multiple floors, and there weren't. And so this was informative as well. With the lack of multiple floors, it suggests that these rooms were not lived in for hundreds and hundreds of years. And I'll get to how that adds to our larger interpretation in a little bit. So as I mentioned earlier, the south room block, which is right over here, this is the north room block. This is the west room block. The south room block, you can't really see. When you walk over it, you can, but you can't really see it otherwise, which is part of the reason it was suggested that these room blocks were 2 stories. And you can actually see the walls here. This is one of the reasons I really like this picture. You can see the cross walls here in the north room block from this angle and this lighting. You can't always see that, but it was kind of neat to be able to see it. So we explored what was going on in the south room block. So this is a picture of the masonry in each of the room blocks. And there's actually, the north room block has 2 portions to it, which I'll discuss in a little bit. But the south room block, and it's hard to see, although I think you can see how kind of messy the wall is. It's not particularly tabular like we see here. And there is a lot of adobe. It's not really cobbles. So it's not, if you're used to seeing membrane architecture, they're not cobbles, but there's a lot of adobe, and it's not laid out really, really neatly. The west room block, you can see, has sort of typical Pueblo masonry. In some ways, there's less adobe, and some of the stones have been shaped. It's not as much shaping as you see in some instances like in Chaco, but there's still shaping. And the same thing is here. This is a little bit lower, so you're seeing some of the big foundation stones, and here is the in-place metate. But again, some of these stones have been shaped, not a lot, but a little bit. And there's not as much adobe as there is in this. And so this, and also this room block is really, really low, the south room block. So this has led us to argue that the south room block is possibly earlier, possibly a different group of people. And also it was maybe stone robbed to help build one of these room blocks. And that would suggest why there's just not as much rock. It's gone, right? It's not even like laying around. This is a bunch of the rock that we took out of this room. That just didn't happen here because there's just not that much rock anymore. And so it seems possible that it was stone robbed. Another aspect of our field work was shovel test pits around the entire site and in the depressions. This was basically looking for buried features so that we couldn't see on the surface. So kind of out in here, in these depressions, it's not, well, that's the kiva, but in the depressions that were here and out here. And we did 50 shovel test pits. And by we, I mean one specific graduate student. And he found a total of 1 artifact. Yeah, that was a lot of shovel test pits for just 1 artifact. But it confirmed that basically what we're seeing on the surface is what's there, right? We didn't find evidence of other pit structures. We didn't find evidence of a cemetery. And if the Pueblo really had been lived in from 1300 to 1680, so almost 400 years, really seems like there should be some kind of cemetery in the area. No evidence of that at all. The other thing we did was various kinds of remote sensing. The red squares here are where we did electric ground conductivity. And this was the same thing. We were looking for anomalies or subsurface features or deposits, and we thought this and other things might help find that. And again, other than the kiva, there was nothing. There's nothing showed up in any of the remote sensing. And so ultimately we could report back to the Forest Service that we found no burials, no evidence of a cemetery. None of the other depressions were cultural, and that really what they're looking at is the site as we can see it from the surface. Okay, the kiva. We put a trench from the middle of the kiva through what we thought might be the backfill area up into the room block. The goal was to clip the trench that Davis and Winkler had excavated. They actually excavated a trench, but then they have this weird thing that comes off the trench, and it looked like they might have excavated a complete quarter of the kiva. But the report's not horribly clear on that, and you saw what the map looked like. So we were trying to understand what they had done in the kiva, and also if they had destroyed the kiva or if there were still features available, because again, the report is not all that clear. So we did, and I don't really have a picture of it because it's not that interesting, but in the north wall, you could see Davis and Winkler's excavations. But we also found, I think more interestingly, a bench, and here you can see that same kind of messy, unshaped stone and masonry architecture that we saw in the south building, but there's a bench and there's also a floor, and we went into the floor to see if there was any more floor surface at depth, and there's not. There's just really one obvious floor surface. So ultimately, with the kiva, we were able to find what David Winkler's work had done and how much damage they did do, and what was still left. We determined that the architectural style was similar to the south building, so we're suggesting that the large kiva is earlier and may have been associated with the south room block. Also here, there is an anomaly into the south of the kiva, and my graduate student who did the work suggested that it might be a ventilator shaft in the south that would have to be tested through excavation. If so, Dave Snow has suggested that this is more of a Western or Kharisan pattern, and that there is Zuni pottery on the site. And so maybe this early occupation is more of a Western Pueblo occupation. But we're currently working with Zuni colleagues out in our new work, and we're collaborating with them on that project to the west. And we took them out to Goat Spring Pueblo. And they pointed out that archaeologists are far more concerned with trying to find these different kinds of architectural patterns in kivas between the east and the west. And that's just not how kiva building is done. And it probably doesn't mean anything, even if it's really there. That doesn't mean it's Western or that it's tied to a certain region. So we're keeping that in mind as we are now working on interpreting the kiva. And then, as I said, up here, we're going back and looking at the stratigraphy. And here you can kind of see this dark area. We think this may be the backfill in this area. So the kiva was excavated and the backfill was thrown up here. This I'm still trying to figure out. This, I think, are intact deposits. So we're still working on trying to understand the stratigraphy in the trash that is immediately outside the kiva. So this is a quick summary of the architectural information that I think is going on. We think there's about 200 rooms. I didn't mention it, but we also found no evidence of a second story when we excavated in the room blocks. We think there's 4 construction phases. This is the south room block, which I mentioned is earlier. Then you have the western room block. Then you have the northern room block. And if you notice on this map, this angle's off in a weird direction. So we worked in here to see if we could understand this angle. And this room block butts up next to this one, but it's not all a continuous back wall. So we think this room block was built and then there was an addition made later. So possibly 4 construction phases. Kiva is the only subsurface structure, no cemetery. And given the lack of trash, the lack of an apparent cemetery, the fact that we think this one was at least built first, right now we are interpreting the site as not being continuous occupation from 1300 to 1680, but intermittent occupation from 1300 to 1680. The pottery is there to confirm those dates. We just don't think it was long-term occupation. We think people were coming and going over time. Okay, so artifacts, what did we find? This is some of the artifacts that I'm going to talk about today. There's also groundstone, which we haven't finished writing up the groundstone. All the analysis is there, but we haven't sat down and really interpreted it. There's other lithic material besides the obsidian that actually still needs to be analyzed. My original analyst wasn't able to do the work, so I need to send it to somebody else. And the faunal remains have been completed, and I got a report from the zoo archaeologist and just haven't worked it into the bigger picture yet. So pottery, my specialty. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that. The decorated pottery. I showed you these rim forms earlier. I have grayed out the rim forms and the information we didn't find. So there's no B rims. There's no surprise there. The B rims are pretty regional and are specific to the Galisteo Basin and Albuquerque areas. We don't find a lot of them in the Rio Abajo, so that's not unusual. None of the weird or unusual A types that are, again, I think specific to certain regions like the Rio Puerco of the East, didn't find any of those. And then none of the E or F types that are associated with Spanish contact. So one of those types is like platters. When the Spanish came in and settled down in some of the pueblos, they wanted specific shapes to be made. Some of those are platters, and there's like also another good example is candlestick holders for the church. We didn't find anything like that. All of the glazewares, or all the decorated pottery is glazewares, and it's lead-based glazes, which I'm going to talk a little bit about in a second. The undecorated pottery, we have both smudged and unsmudged planeware. This is no surprise for those of you who may be familiar with the Mogollon area. Smudging is common. Others have suggested that the Rio Abajo has clear connections to the Mogollon area over time. And so it's no surprise to see good smudged pottery and undecorated ware at this site. And it's common to other sites in the southern Rio Grande area as well. So provenance, where was the pottery being made? I did petrography on the pottery. Due to the geological diversity of the Rio Grande area, and New Mexico in general, actually, Rio Grande archaeologists have a long tradition of doing petrography to determine where pottery was made. And I'm going to just use this slide to quickly explain that for those of you who aren't familiar with this technique. Basically, the idea is that the temper, so the non-plastic material that is either in clay, be like the sand, you collect clay and it has sand in it from the immediate geological area, or sometimes potters add temper intentionally to make the workability of certain clays, make it less sticky, make it hold its shape better. That's all local geology. And because of the diversity, you can look at those pieces of temper inside the pot and figure out where it came from geologically. So what I do is you've got your sherd, got your profile, you cut a piece off, glue it to a thin section, and then you polish it down like a jeweler polishes gemstones or something like that. You polish it down until light shines through it, and then you use a petrographic microscope to look at the inside of a sherd. So that's what this is. This green is glazed paint. This dark line here is a red slip. So on the outside, like right in here, if you can, the red slip. This is the clay, the paste is the clay, and then this is grog. This is a piece of temper. And in this case, this temper is a piece of sherd. So sherd tempered pottery. So that is the general idea. And that's what I did for this study to figure out whether the pottery was local or not. So I looked at both utility wares and the decorated wares. I looked at collections of different kinds of rocks and sands in the area. So this was all collected. It's almost all rhyolite tuffs. So most of the pottery tempered with local sands. And those local sands are from these various kinds of rhyolite tuffs. That's what this is. And you can tell it's sand because it's rounded as opposed to hard angular pieces of rock. There are other local rocks that show up in the samples. And so it looks like people are collecting, the potters are collecting the sands possibly from the local drainages and arroyos. But it matches geological samples from the area, all of this material inside these clays, and also geological descriptions of the area. So I'm confident that most of the pottery is local and it's tempered with this material. Almost all of the utility wares was made locally based upon this criteria. There's a couple of exceptions, which I'm going to talk about towards the end of the talk. 90% of the decorated wares were made locally. So yeah, most of the pottery is made on or near the site. However, there are some non-local glaze wares. You can see here, even if you're not a petrographer, these look different than what I just showed you. So these are different kinds of materials. And this is kind of the breakdown. That 10% of glaze wares are kind of coming from all over the place. So it really looks like folks at Rio Grande, or I'm sorry, at Goat Spring Pueblo are keeping contact with pueblos in other places. The other thing we looked at was the lead. I talked earlier about there's a local lead source. So lead in the glazes. This is a quick photo. You don't have to look at it closely if you're not familiar with reading these. But working with Judith Habik-Moshe, we looked at 48 locally made glazewares and compared it to known lead sources. And if you want more about the chemistry of this, I can talk about, or you can email me and I can share it with you, the reports and the other papers. However, this is the results. 83% of the lead came from Hansenburg, which is about 100 miles east of the village. 8% came from the Cerrillos area. 2% used the local lead sources. So they knew about them because they are using them, but they're getting lead to make the paint on their locally made pottery from far away. So We had assumed that these connections would have broken down at Spanish contact and people would have started using the local using the local lead at some point. But that common wisdom doesn't seem to be true, at least not in this case, right? That Pueblo trade networks were not as disrupted as we thought. And there's a graduate student, a recent graduate from U of A, Evan Giomi, who made this argument in his dissertation as well, that things were not as disrupted by the Spanish as believed. Similar with the obsidian, we assumed that at some point folks at Goat Spring Pueblo would start relying on the local obsidian. Almost all of the obsidian is flakes, so that suggests that people are making their own obsidian objects. They're not getting tools from somewhere else, but rather they're getting obsidian and they're working it. And so working with Jeff Ferguson at MUR, the University of Missouri Research Reactor, we looked at all of the obsidian from the site, so 58 pieces using XRF. And again, if you're interested in the chemistry, email me and I can send you some papers. But it turns out the results, 75% of the obsidian is coming from Mount Taylor and only 10% is coming from the site that is in a half a day's walking distance from Goat Spring Pueblo. So again, this suggests that the Pueblo trade networks had not been as disrupted as much as we thought, or people, if they're walking there themselves, they are freely moving over the landscape without the Spanish stopping them. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, there's blue-green minerals on the site, not a lot. Again, all of the material looks, it's debitage from somebody at the site, or at least one somebody at the site, making their own blue-green ornaments, right? They're not getting ornaments from elsewhere. And so again, we did XRF. The interesting thing about smithsonite, which is locally available, is that it is a zinc-based mineral, unlike turquoise and various other minerals in the Southwest that are copper-based. And it's the only zinc blue-green mineral that's common to the area. So we used XRF to look at zinc. This isn't all of the samples. This is just an example. And you can see, right, this is the zinc line down here. You can see that some samples have this huge peak at zinc and others don't. Others have it at copper. So we think most of the material is smithsonite, but it's only 14 pieces. I think 8 of them are smithsonite, meaning that somebody is using the local blue-green mineral to make ornaments, but they're also getting some kind of material from someplace else. Oh, okay, yeah, 9 samples are zinc. And so most of the material is coming from the immediate local area. Okay, so for the artifacts, locally made pottery, but the lead to make that decorated pottery is not local. 10% of the decorated pottery is made elsewhere. There's locally made obsidian tools, but the obsidian is not local. And there's locally made blue-green ornaments, and most of that material is local. So that's sort of the quick summary of what we figured out in terms of the artifacts so far. Okay, so the last couple of slides are about enriched deposits. These are just unusual things we found that people have found interesting. We're defining enriched deposits as highly structured cultural deposits. But they're deposits that are intentional, and we argue that they are associated with ritual activities after work done by Walker, LaMotta, and Adams. So I have 3 to briefly talk about today. The first one is this collection of charcoal, small mammal bones, and burnt corn kernels and cobs. This is just a very small example of what was recovered. It seems kind of boring to those of us who are pottery people, but I think it was actually meaningful and was an enriched deposit. Specifically, thinking that it's some kind of feasting assemblage. And this is where that deposit came from, feature 2. This is underneath the floor in the north room block. So it was put underneath and then plastered over in the floor and was built on top of it, and it no longer had access to it. So we think the material was in this unlined, unfired, informal pit that was not dug through the floor. And two similar pits have been described at other sites in the Rio Abajo area, and it's been argued that they were associated with feasting activities that are commonly performed prior to the building of a room block that is in the Rio Abajo area. Linda Cordell suggested that the charcoal lenses that we see in some of our trash deposits that are corn cobs and faunal remains, and they're usually at the bottom of our trash deposits, are also the remains of these pre-construction feasts. So by placing some of these remains of a feast in soon-to-be constructed rooms, it's potentially some kind of ritual that is tying the new home into past homes through similar kinds of feasting events, and the cosmology of the ritual and the cosmology that kind of goes with those types of events. So that's sort of an interesting, unusual deposit that we have been able to hopefully interpret. In the kiva, the second enriched deposit includes two left scapula from an artiodactyl, an adult artiodactyl, and a small gray ware jar. And the jar was tested for pollen because it's very small. There was 1 grain of corn pollen found in it, but the folks who did the analysis think that it's post-depositional and that there's actually very little pollen in the vessel, and we can't make the argument that it was full of corn or any other kind of pollen. So we had hoped, but no such luck. However, these two things were located on the kiva. The scapula were located on the bench. The location of the jar is actually in the fill right off the bench. We think it probably was on the bench, but then eventually fell off as deposits were washing in. We interpret this assemblage as being part of a possible closing ceremony of the kiva. The kiva has no evidence of being burned, which is a common kind of closing, but maybe it was informally closed. Walker and colleagues argue that these might be the kinds of things that are worn out ceremonial objects that are placed into the kiva because they're just not being used anymore. And so they stay with the kiva when the kiva gets closed. And so that was an interesting find. It's literally the only thing we found in place in the kiva. And there's no evidence that Davis and Winkler found anything in place in the kiva either. And then finally, the final enriched deposit is 4 reconstructible vessels, one that was full of ash, and a basalt wand is what we called it when we excavated it. And this assemblage is from a room in the south room block, but it appears to have been intentionally placed in the room after the room was abandoned or unoccupied. So there was the floor, there was 30 centimeters of wind and water blown deposits, and then there was this pit that had been placed in those deposits at some point. So it was after the room was no longer being used. These are the pots from one level. There's more of the pots, but I didn't want to mix and match things from different levels. The 4 vessels are especially interesting as they appear to have been made someplace different mostly. The only decorated vessel is a shirred temple pot from Hawiku, probably the Zuni area. There's also micaceous utility ware, possibly from the Albuquerque area, a sand-tempered utility ware of unknown provenance. And then the vessel that was full of ash is a rhyolite tempered, locally produced smudged ware. The ash looks like it had been from a hot fire. There's no evidence of faunal or skeletal remains, and it looks like it was probably plant material. And then the wand, or whatever we want to end up calling this, is made from a non-local igneous rock. And some people have suggested to me that it was a lithophone. So it is a pot. It's a kind of rock that when you strike it, it makes this really neat ringing sound, which it does. It's the right material for that. And there's evidence that Pueblo people use those in kivas in various places in the historic period. So 3 of those pots are coming from other places. One of them is local. We are interpreting this as pots that are that represent pieces of different places, objects that maybe tied the people who buried this material to connections to specific places. And this might have been a way to bring that place with them to a new location, or it might have been added to the south room block as potentially a piece of the past. We don't know for sure. It's possibly more nuanced than we can ever know. But we suspect that the folks living at the site, that this was some kind of ritual resulting in these deposits to tie them to place or tie them to time period and continuity on the landscape. So that's what we have so far. This is a brief summary to remind you of what I had originally hoped to research out there. Deb as well, I believe we were in agreement on that. But then this is what we really have now. Intermittent use of the site for almost 400 years. Rio Grande exchange networks may not have been as disrupted by Spanish contact as we thought. Distant resources were sometimes more important than the easy access of local resources. Maybe they're places of cosmological importance. Maybe they helped gain access and maintenance of social networks with other villages, maybe both. No evidence for interaction with the Spanish. Maybe this village was a form of resistance. We don't really have a way to test that. And then we have these various enriched deposits that we're arguing are rituals that help tie residents to greater Pueblo cosmology across time and space. So we're in the process of writing the report. We need to finish the stone tools, finish the ground stone, take a harder look at the stratigraphy, and we need to revisit what we know about this period in the greater region. It was said a few years ago that this is a Pueblo 4 site, and it was said that probably all the large Pueblo 4 sites have been found. We know about them. And when we started working at Goat Spring Pueblo, we believed that. But this is me this past week in the field. These are my co-PIs on the Lion Mountain project, excavating in a room block that was disturbed, possibly by Emmylou Davis, at another Pueblo 4 site contemporaneous with Goat Spring Pueblo. And we have located at least 2 more sites that we think are contemporaneous with Goat Spring Pueblo. All of these sites are within a half-day's walk. So that really suggests that this area was more occupied than we originally thought, and we need to sort of put our current research into our understanding of Goat Spring Pueblo. And that's it. Thank you so much for coming and listening on this Saturday. Please feel free to email me if you want more information, detailed information, or if you want copies of our current publications or our report as we finish it. I am happy to provide information as we put it together. And just remember, this is a work in progress, so there will be more information hopefully within the next year or 2.
Great. Thank you so much, Suzanne. I've got a few questions if you don't mind.
Sure.
Let's see. One from Sam. Is Goat Spring on what has been called the Chaco Meridian?
It depends on how broad you want the Chaco Meridian to be. But no, it's a little bit west of what we think of as being the Chaco Meridian.
Okay, and another kind of related question from Rod. How were the residents and then related to Chaco populations?
This site dates, so 1300 dates 200 years, 150 years after Chaco. It is quite possible that people living at Goat Spring Pueblo were descendants of some of the folks at Chaco, and the Chaco connection is actually what we're interested in part in our current research over in the Lion Mountain area, because we've identified a Chacoan outlier out in that area. And again, that would have been a day's walk from Goat Spring Pueblo, but the residents living there would have been later than the Chaco phenomena.
Okay. And another one from Rod, assuming the style of ceramics was coiling.
Yes, it was coil and scrape, all of it. There's no uh oh my God, I'm losing the word, but no paddle and anvil. There's just coil and
Okay.
scrape.
And here's one from Connie that I was wondering, were the lead glazes only on the exterior of the pots? Wondering about possible lead poisoning from pots used for foods.
Yes, so the lead poisoning is on the, I'm sorry, the lead poisoning, the lead glazes are on the inside of the bowls. And sometimes on the outside of bowls and then on the outside of jars. So people have wondered about the evidence of lead poisoning. So lead poisoning would happen if the material, that's inside the bowls were acidic. It's more likely to happen. And we don't really know what they're putting inside of those bowls. But we're assuming different kinds of corn meals and stews and that sort of thing. Nothing that we know of that was being used probably would have been acidic enough to really cause a problem. And then there has been no evidence of lead poisoning on any of the skeletal work that has been done over the years. Although in working with the lead glazes and in scraping them and in working with them as archaeologists, we work in a fume hood just so that we don't breathe in that lead. Because yes, the possibility of lead poisoning is there, but we just don't have any good evidence of it.
Yeah. Question I had, as far as your Pueblo advisors, the Zunis and other, were there any oral histories on this site about what they believe?
So that is something that this site's not part of our current research. The Zuni, so we've talked specifically with the Zuni, and we hope to bring other tribes in, and we've been slowly working on that because Acoma also has worked in the area and I'm sorry, have lived in the area, and it's the traditional hunting grounds. This site is right on the edge of what the Zuni consider their traditional lands and traditional grounds. But there's no oral traditions about this site specifically, but the area in general, there are oral traditions that both the Acoma and the Zuni have for this area. And some of the sites, they have said, oh, this seems like some of the stories we've heard, but we need to talk about, we need to talk about that more and think about that more.
Yeah, especially like with the feast deposits.
Mhm.
Did they see that before on other sites?
So they weren't out there when we're excavating. We only started our collaboration with the Lion Mountain work, and so they actually did not come out and see that material when we were excavating, and so we haven't talked to them about those specifics
Yeah.
yet. They will look at the report before we finalize it, and have agreed to do that, but they weren't out there for when we were excavating that. The evidence that we have of the feasting material comes from the Rio Grande area, and I'm not aware of that in the Zuni area, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, this was great. So many more questions. You got your work cut out for you.
Yeah, no, it's been a lot of fun. And I think you said that you would be able to post my email when you post this.
Yeah, it'll go out later this evening in an email, and I'll put that on there along with the recording.
Okay. So
Great.
please, anybody feel free to email me if you have further questions or you think of other interpretations of things. I'm happy to take any and all information.